Garratts. A perplexing piece of locomotive history and design. Well, if you're in America. Yeah, see, for us Americans, Garratts are positively bizarre, because frankly, we just didn't use them. At all. We didn't like them. But a lot of other places in the world did get great use out of them, and find them pretty familiar. But why do they look like that? I mean, you can tell it's a steam engine, but like they got a tender in the front, and their drivers are on the tenders. What? Why? Why any of this? What is happening? What crazy nonsense is this? Well, it's not nearly as crazy once you understand the context, and Garratts do have significant advantages in some applications. Not all, but some applications. Which is why, globally, they were pretty successful as a design. Again, just not here in America. The origin of the Garratt design can be traced back to one Herbert William Garratt, both the namesake and the designer of the layout. He was an English mechanical engineer who served as an apprentice under John Carter Park, who was at that time the locomotive superintendent of the North London Railway. Eventually, Garratt would join the Argentine Central Railway in 1889, becoming the locomotive superintendent there in 1892, and between the years of 1900 and 1906, he worked at various railways in Central and South America, Cuba, Lagos, and Lima, Peru. Eventually, he would be on an inspector role at the New South Wales Government Railways. He would design his most famous creation, the Garratt-type steam locomotive. Garratt's intention with the design was to allow for more sophisticated articulation, as well as for the boiler and firebox to not be as restricted in relation to the amount of wheels. Basically, since the wheels aren't actually under the boiler and firebox, which is the antithesis of basically every other steam locomotive design, they could be really big without having to worry about any of that. Effectively, the running gear was under two separate tenders, with the cab, boiler, and firebox forming sort of a bridge between said tenders. Within the tenders would be the oil or coal, as well as the water, and since the design called for basically three separate components, there were three separate parts of articulation, with the tenders, as well as the main locomotive body, being able to turn separately from each other around curves. It also allowed for more power in theory, since there would be more driving wheels per unit of locomotive weight. And this was very important on tracks that had very low loading gauges. A Garratt could be pretty big without necessarily being at risk of breaking the track underneath them. Garratts were known to produce almost as much as twice the tractive effort of conventional steam engines. They can carry more fuel, since they effectively have two tenders, and generally larger ash pans, which again weren't restricted because of the running gear. And they also ran equally well in either direction, since the view was effectively the same, so turntables weren't a factor. However, they did have at least one major disadvantage, and that was because the drivers were under, effectively, the tenders. That meant that as you use the fuel and water, technically the adhesive weight would decrease, you'd have less of it. But as long as the designer was aware of this phenomenon, you could usually get around it by just adding more drivers, since Garratt's allowed for a lot of them. Garratt did have some difficulty getting a company to actually build his design. He approached Kitson & Company first, but they said no because they were already committed to the Kitson-Mayer articulated design. He then went to Bayer Peacock & Company, who were highly skeptical, but still gave it a shot anyway. In 1907, they would propose a very small engine, a 2-foot gauge, 040 plus 040. Because yes, Garratts have to be listed in the plus format under the white notation, because they have two sets of drivers and leaders and trailers, and yeah! That design wasn't built. But in 1908, a design for a 2-foot gauge Malay locomotive was submitted in reply to an inquiry from the government of Tasmania. Bayer would see an opportunity and throw the Garratt design at them too, because, well, they were both articulated designs and could accomplish similar things. This newer design was a bit larger than the original one, but had the capacity to negotiate curves of 99 feet radius and 1 in 25 gradients. and it was accepted by Tasmania. 2 locomotives were built in 1909, and these would be known as the K class, the first Garratts ever constructed. And one of them is still alive. Yeah, she's in preservation, K1, and that's pretty cool. Though it is worth mentioning that K1 and her sister weren't quite in line with Garratt's original design parameters, as Tasmanian Railways wanted a few specialized things for theirs. For one thing, they were compound configurations. They had 2 high-pressure cylinders which were on the rear engine unit, or tender, whatever, and a pipe led to 2 larger, low-pressure cylinders on the front engine unit. Garratt had not actually incorporated any compounding in his original design whatsoever. That was not a thing he considered, but Tasmania wanted that. Tasmanian Railways also asked that both sets of cylinders face inwards. The intention behind that was to reduce the distance between the main steam pipe and the high-pressure cylinders, as well as between the high-pressure and low-pressure cylinders, making the compounding easier. But that secondary decision made things a bit obnoxious. The locomotives were unnecessarily complicated because of that change, and the high-pressure cylinders were therefore directly underneath the cab, making it really, really, really hot. And the crews hated that. Only one more Garratt design that is known was produced with compound propulsion, also by Bayer Peacock Company in 1927 for Burma Railways. They also decided not to build any more with inward-facing cylinders because though there were a couple designs made by other companies that did have that, even though it was generally considered to be a stupid friggin' idea. A third Garratt was constructed in 1910 for the Darjeeling Himalayan Railway, and the first mainline class of Garratt wasn't constructed until 1911, and this was for the Western Australian Government Railways. The M class, which were 260 plus 062s. As you can see, despite being made in the UK, a lot of countries outside of the UK were the ones that really liked them. They were seen all over places like Africa, Asia, and Australia. And as time went on, their size potential was pushed, and even at the end of steam, it was believed that Garratts could have been pushed a lot further than they were, mostly limited by the fact that only a certain group of countries tended to like them. Even within the UK, while they had some, no designers really pushed the envelope with them to any significant extent, and the one time one did, they wound up with a particularly bad one. So, it really wasn't attempted again. But Garratts were almost as varied as conventional steam locomotives. There were good and bad. And the bad ones shouldn't be a reflection on the Garratts just being a terrible design, because they're not. Depending on the railroad's needs, a Garratt design can provide both articulation and power on windy track, something that conventional steam locomotives tend to struggle with. To date, there are at least 250 Garratts still left on the planet, though it's hard to say exactly how true that is, because some are in a state of disrepair, or effectively abandoned, and a whole bunch of other factors. But they are a neat thing to see. But I bet you're wondering, wait a minute, wait. Darkness, you said in the beginning that America didn't like Garratts. And I bet you're wondering what the frickin' problem was. Why didn't we use Garratts basically at all? Well, it was because of that one weakness that I mentioned before. Remember how I said that one of the issues with them is that as you use the fuel, technically the adhesion does go down on the wheels? Well, basically every North American railway was worried about that. They felt that it was too much of a risk in that way. Even though it was never a major problem as long as the designs were put together well, it was something that they were too worried about to actually take advantage of it. Alco even gained the license to build Garratts in America. They were permitted to do that, and did offer them, but not a single American railroad wanted them to produce anything of the sort. Alco never even bothered to produce a prototype or a demonstrator to try to prove that it could work. And instead, when it came to us over here, we settled on simple articulates for our articulated needs, resulting in big, biggest engines you could possibly imagine. Witness our unspeakable power! We didn't want Garratts. We just didn't want them. It's just one of those things. But that doesn't mean they're bad, not at all. Some are in running condition on heritage railways all over the world, and at least one did eventually make its way to America. Yeah, in 1975. I know, really late. But she was a 262 plus 262 Garratt NG class number 50, formerly of the South African Railways. She was imported to be used on the private 2-foot gauge Hempstead and Northern Railroad in Hempstead, Texas. And yes, she's still there. Seriously, they preserved her, they protected her. And you know what? Hey, okay, yeah, we don't like Garratts over here generally, all right? North Americans, we're not all about those Garratts, but the one we took, we protected the baby. You gotta give us that. You gotta give us that. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fun farewell.